Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome to XD Enterprise Live Meet the Makers. My name is Tor Gunderson, and I'm on the strategic development team here at Adobe, focused on Adobe XD. If you're joining us for the first time, this is a series where our team takes half an hour every 2 weeks to chat about all things XD. If XD is new to you, it's the platform that lets you design, prototype, and share digital experiences, including mobile apps, websites, voice interfaces, games, and a whole lot more. Over the course of this series, we've had the privilege to be joined by some incredible guests talking about everything from design systems to plugins, prototyping, accessibility, and the list goes on. Now, before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to encourage you to fill out our survey. You should see the link posted in the chat, and it's on the screen right here. We couldn't put the show on without your input, and we really take the results from the survey to plan each and every episode. So please keep it coming. And by the way, when you do complete the survey, you'll have a chance to win a whole year of Creative Cloud. Now, throughout this session, if you have any comments or questions, please use the chat pod. We have some incredible colleagues working behind the scenes to respond to you and provide lots of great resources. All right, so what's in store for today? Well, if you're not aware, we release new features in XD all the time. And to be honest, it can be really hard to keep track. Since launching in October 2017, we've pushed out releases almost every month. And this month is no exception, having just dropped XD32 this week. So we're gonna do a roundup of many of these new features, going back to XD30, our big June release. These features include scroll groups, design tokens and stacks, my personal fave, from XD30, and multiple flows and keyboard shortcuts for design, prototype, and share modes from XD32. Our next big release will be at Adobe Max, our annual creativity conference, which is October 20th through the 22nd. We're planning to launch some really amazing features, and I know you're going to be blown away. I, for one, cannot wait. And speaking of Adobe Max, if you haven't heard, it's going to be all virtual this year with over 350 sessions. And once more, it's free, so don't wait, go, please register. It's going to be our biggest Max ever. Okay, so let's get this party started. It gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce Dani Beaumont, who will be taking us through all these new features. Now, Dani started a career at Adobe back when Adobe only had 120 employees, and Photoshop was still on a floppy disk, double-sided, of course, if for those of you who even remember floppy disks. In the years that followed, she moved from the desktop publishing era to web and interaction design, but her passion has remained focused on delivering the power of technology into the hands of creative professionals around the world. She's currently a principal product manager on Adobe XD, responsible for new feature delivery. So welcome, Dani. And before you get going, since we're talking about features, I mentioned that Stacks is my favorite. Which one is yours?
Hey, Tor, thank you. It's a good question. I just finished, I know we have a lot of LinkedIn folks that are here. I just finished doing probably what's going to be a 5-hour LinkedIn Learning Essentials training for XD. I'm really fascinated with design systems and atomic design, the hierarchical structure of features as they all fit together. We'll play with that a little bit today, but when you really bring all the features together as a system and start to build out a structure of content, it's amazing. I just really find that fascinating right now. So
that's awesome. Design systems are near and dear to my heart, so you're speaking my language.
Yep. Okay.
I will let you take it away.
Perfect. Okay, so as you mentioned, we're going to kind of roll back to XD30. There have been many updates, as you can tell. So we often even have to look at a list to see what's happened in the last couple months with the release. XD30 brought a few features that are pretty amazing that I want to talk about today. One of them is scroll groups. So I'm just going to dive in and start playing a little bit here. Tor, as you go along, please shout out if you have any questions or if anything comes up in the chat. I'm happy to just kind of play around a little bit here. So
absolutely,
very casual.
Absolutely.
When we talk about multiple scroll actually, or just the ability to scroll for a moment. If I come here to this initial artboard and we kind of look at how artboards work in XD today, you probably, if you're familiar with XD, understand this idea where there's this idea of a viewport or the height of an artboard. So quite often on the web, when you're working, or not on the web, when you're working on an interface, you'll have content that scrolls up. It could be a web page, it could be an app, but it's usually fixed in width and variable in height. And when you design an artboard in XD, you have the ability to come in and say, what is that viewport, by dragging this handle, something that I set here in the properties inspector. And if I bring up a preview of this window now, you can see how it handles it well. I can scroll the content there into view. I can make this a little smaller for my kind of small screen here. And that works well. That's one way that you scroll. But as you work, there start to be interfaces that you want to prototype where you might have an iframe that you're representing with content that scrolls within it, or you want to actually introduce horizontal scrolling and vertical scrolling. Things like panning around a map would scroll in both directions. So I could always come here. Let's say I had this navigation that I wanted to sit on top. I can come in and drop it into my interface and have that sit at the bottom by fixing it in its location. And then once again, when I'm scrolling, that stuff will stay on top and I can see the content below. But it's a bit limited. So what scroll groups allow you to do is really take a collection of content and decide how you want to display it in a way that can really simulate a lot more content that we see out there in the real world. So let's say I was working on the content that I see here that I've got on my design canvas on the right-hand side. What I want to do is have the content scroll between this header and this footer. I can always layer the content behind in the example I showed you a moment ago. But what I want to also do is have some of it scroll horizontally, this one horizontally, and then the rest scroll vertically. And that starts to get complicated to represent. So scroll groups are probably one of the easiest features around. You can come in and select a group of objects. So with them selected here in the Properties Inspector, there's this adorable, subtle little toggle that I can choose between. One represents horizontal scroll, the other vertical, and then the third in both directions. So I know that I want this to be a horizontal scroll. I'll go ahead and select that. Notice that on the design canvas, I have it selected with that blue highlight, and I have these drag handles. And it's these handles that let me determine, in essence, the viewport for this little gathering of content that I had. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this first content over here onto my artboard. And I want to reduce that to fit within the window. So I'll go ahead and just bring that all over and take this a little bit further for a moment. So if I wanted, actually, yeah. So let's just take a look at that before I go much further. I'm going to come on in and bring in that desktop preview app one more time. We'll bring that onto the screen. Got this guy here. So what I've really subtly done is instead of scrolling up and down, when I come in, I can scroll horizontally. So pretty slick. I have that behavior just like that with just a couple clicks. Really pretty simple. Let's say I wanted to make it a little more complex now. So if I bring this guy back out, I'm going to just give myself room to play because this is a rather small artboard. What I want to do is have that be one scroll group. So I'll go ahead and reduce it to about the width of the content that I have below. And then I've got another scroll group that I want to come in and define. So I'll go in and set that one. Scroll groups can nest within one another, which makes it really amazing. So I can have those two sets that are scrolling horizontally and then come on into the full content that I want to have on the page and set that one to a vertical scroll. And then I'll just come on up and set the size. I can always have it scroll behind content. So I'll go ahead and bring it onto the artboard here. And then I'll make sure that I layer it behind everything else using a little keyboard shortcut there. I'll go to the footer content and make sure that that's pinned as well. And now when I bring up that preview, notice I can scroll down as I normally would, but at any time I can come on in and scroll horizontally as I'm going. Go on up here and scroll horizontally. So I get to show that more complex experience. In fact, one of the best parts about features, I think, in XD is the sophistication that the engineering team really implements. So when they design a feature, they try really hard to make sure that it works in as many places as possible. So scroll groups can work in lots of different scenarios. One is, let's say I have an overlay. So this is a menu that I want to have occur on many different artboards. And within that overlay, I have a scroll group. If I come here to bring that up, assuming I wire it, let's go in and do that. So if I wanted this to actually, that's where it is. So if I'm going to go and find something, I want to bring up the overlay. So if I come to this guy here and bring up the overlay, although it's in an overlay, I can even add another scroll group. So that's one. It's just the first. Any questions on that? We're pretty good. You're gonna.
I think we're good.
We're gonna blast through.
I love that you can embed them into overlays.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really pretty amazing.
You can also link from objects within them to other objects, which is extra amazing. We're gonna. I'm just gonna keep hitting you today because I've got so many features. But we'll circle back on this a little bit as we talk about some of the other features too. So another one is one that we just delivered, and that's keyboard shortcuts that allow you to jump between the different modes. So I have design mode here, prototype, and share. And there's something known as mouse elbow. If you play tennis, you get tennis elbow from hitting a lot of balls. If you have a big monitor, you can end up with what we consider mouse elbow, which is having to go all the way to the other side of your screen to grab something. So the more you can automate having keyboard shortcuts or right menu options, the better off your productivity is, especially in large displays. So having shortcuts that allow me to jump between these modes is pretty terrific. It turns out we've always had one that I just learned about, which is if I hit Control or on Mac or Windows and then the Tab key, notice up here it's going to toggle between each of those modes. There's share mode, design, and prototype. So that's been in older releases. What we've added is if I hold down, I have to try this for a second because it's new. If I hold down the Option on Mac or Alt on Windows, I can type 1 to go to design mode, 2 for prototype, and 3 for share. So as I show you some of these features that we have for multiple flows, you'll see why it's nice to be able to dance between those modes using those shortcut keys. I'm going to go back to design mode, and let's talk a little bit now about multiple flows. So if you've ever done much work in XD or worked on an actual project, what happens an awful lot is you end up repeating content. So XD is a tool that allows you to design at the speed of thought. It's very agile, very fast, but it also takes time to communicate so many different UI situations. Let's say all of these artboards I needed to show both portrait and landscape orientation. You can end up doubling up on your artboards just to show that different mode. So as we said at the top of this session, this idea of a design system with a hierarchical structure can be really exciting because your goal is to really have as little redundancy of content as possible. So your client says, I hate that logo, can you change it? Ideally, you go to one place in your system and change it, and it propagates. Having multiple flows does a few things. One is that you may have, as I do, lots of different designs that you're working on. It allows you to define a prototype or a design spec for any individual grouping of artboards, publish that out, and then retain all the settings so that you don't have to remember what you did time over time. It also, even kind of more powerfully, allows you to share artboards with those multiple flows. So let's say I'm doing an exploration here, and I'm going to turn off my guides real quick. Let's say I'm not really sure if my tiles here should be a horizontal flow using that scroll group that we just saw a little earlier, or I want to just have people scroll down on the page and see the individual thumbnails. What I want to do is do some user testing. I want to put it in front of some users and see which ones they prefer. Everything here to the right, though, I really don't want to duplicate it for one test and duplicate it for a second test. I want to try to share that. So the rule with multiple flows is you need to have the first artboard be unique. It could just be a placeholder like flow 1. I could just put the text there and then jump into it. But you do need to have a unique starting point or the home screen in your flow. So if I jump over to prototype mode and go ahead and select all, you can see what I've done here. It's pretty straightforward. So whenever I click on one of the tiles within this group here, it'll take me to that first artboard. And then if I click on the header area, it's just going to return me back to the previous artboard. What I want to do is test that flow with these two different doorways in essence. So I've gone in and linked the thumbnails here to the right artboards and then here to the right artboards. What I want to do now is this A/B test or this user feedback test. For that, I'm going to come here in prototype mode and click on the first artboard that I want to be part of the flow. And notice when I do that, I can see the wires that are associated with that first flow. If I click here on the home screen now on the left-hand side, this new feature now allows me to define that as its own flow. So I may come in and call this test horizontal. Next thing, I'll come in and create that second doorway. So if I come here, click on it, I'll call this test vertical. Pretty simple, right? Another sort of cool part about defining flows is that it's really easy now to know which artboards are related or wired to that home screen. So if I come here to this label and press and drag, notice it'll show me all the wires that are part of that. So I can drag that off. If I jump back to design mode, just as an organizational feature, I can still drag and work with those. So it's just a nice way to keep things collected. If I come back to prototype mode and grab test vertical, notice it's sharing those same artboards and it's showing me that that's true. So now that I have those two doorways set, I want to publish out to usability studies. I'm going to switch over to share mode. We added this feature a couple months back, but in order to organize how you're sharing a bit better, we now have that workspace layout, that mode. And when I'm here, whenever I click on a particular flow, everything that's not part of that flow grays out. This is kind of a way to pre-flight before I bother publishing it up to the web. I can switch between any of the flows that I've defined here and quickly see which artboards will be included in the publishing process. Now I can just come in and say, okay, this is my usability study, study number 1, test horizontal. Notice if I come here into my drop down, let's just see, that's interesting. Usually as I do this, there you go. So when I click on the flow here in the share area, it's going to grab the name that I defined for that first flow or second flow in this case. So I can always override this and give it a different name, but it just helps me to stay organized. Then I'll come in and say, I'm going to do a user test on this, and I want to go ahead and publish up a link. So quickly I go out and do that. If I then want to come in and make changes, I can always go back to design mode, iterate on it. Notice that I get information now here that says, guess what? Here's the time that you just published that. Here's the link that was created. You can copy that link or embed it into a custom web page I might be designing. In the dropdown, it remembers that name, and I have it here so that I can go back, make changes, and just republish. I could do the same with that first one. Let's say test horizontal. I'll come in and give this a name. And I could change the environment. This could be what I give to my developer if I wanted. Because we know we're doing another usability study, I'll go ahead and do user test again. And I'll go ahead and update that. I published it just before this demo just to make sure everything was good there. But notice now I've got test horizontal. I can come on in and jump to the other one if I want, make updates, and go forward. So incredibly powerful as you're starting to organize your content and end up with a big design canvas with lots of different flows.
Hey, Dani.
Yes, sir.
Question from the chat from Benjamin Hopka.
Mm-hmm.
So I see you've got an artboard there that says kind of flow exploration.
Yes.
I guess with the new multiple flows, you probably don't even need that anymore to label. What do you think?
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree. So this was our old world. This is how we used to keep our act together. There's less of a need for it. The good thing slash odd thing is as I zoom out, see how I can always see what flows I got going on? It can be a little bit of a crowded house, but I think it's extraordinary. So yes, I would personally rely on this more than these headings.
Yeah, cool. It's a great way
Yeah.
to organize for sure.
Yep. Okay. Rolling right along, we're going to talk a little bit about stacks or design tokens. Let's talk about design tokens, and then I'm going to swing back on stacks because I want to show you how stacks and scroll groups all come together as more of a solution or a system. So design tokens, the idea behind that is let's say Tor is my developer and he and I are developing this as a native web application. And he knows the environment that he's going to work in. We've talked about the design, but we're remote. We don't sit in the same place. And it can be cumbersome for us to constantly communicate with one another as the design changes and would affect the code that Tor is developing. So design tokens tend to be friendly names that allow us to have a conversation or communicate details about our design without having to say, hey, Tor, do me a favor. You see this really great green color? It's hex value 618871. I mean, it's very difficult to go by hex value or a CSS attribute or an H1 tag, things of that sort, by speaking about the CSS styling, things of that sort. So if I were handing this off to Tor, we might have some common language for the web that we're working on. I've gone in and labeled some of my colors using kind of web terms. So I've got my primary gray, primary putty, and black and yellow. Below that, I have some that I didn't change. So I can always come into any of these and just double click on it and give it a nice name. I say primary green, if I hover over it, I can always see that hex value. It doesn't go away, but I have that name that will become a design token when I hand this off to Tor as a developer. Same thing with character styles. Some of these have the default name that XD assigns to them when you save it as a character style by selecting content on the canvas and just saving it up. I've overridden that default name with some web-friendly names. Notice as I roll over it, I still know what typeface it is, what those attributes are, but I've got that token set. So if I kind of speed over, I'm going to save a little bit of time and jump over to the prototype that I had mentioned I delivered a little earlier. Actually, let's just go do this again real quick. Having changed those attributes, I'll take one of these prototypes we designed. And instead of republishing or changing that user study link that I created, I can come in and create a brand new link using the same flow. But this is for Tor as my developer to actually start talking about the specifications. So I might call this test horizontal spec. And in the view settings, I'm going to go ahead and go to the development version. If I hover over this, it tells you which view settings are being saved for that one. Notice here I can come in and say, go ahead and let Tor download the assets. And I'm going to optimize those for, in this case, the web. And I'll create a new link now for that. So I publish it up, I copy it, or I can always do a private invitation where I actually email Tor and say, hey, I've got a link for you. This one right now is a public link, which is fine for what we're doing. This is where you rely on the web to support you, or questions from the audience to fill a little bit of time. Only a moment or two.
It's
It is
almost
so
there.
almost there. By the time you ask the question, oh, look at that.
I know.
See, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the web page. So in this example, this is what's called a design spec or share for development. So if Tor were to take a look at this now, he can still come in and look at the design. He can jump through and see all of the artboards. He can see what's linked to those artboards. So he has that view available to him as he understands. Notice this one is the one that has artboards linked to it. These do not. So he can come and inspect all of that. When he's done, he can go back out to any one of the design pages and he can look at the specifications. So he's like, okay, Dani does have an asset that's here. Here's the colors she's using. If I went in, notice it says primary green and it has the hex value. If I went in and changed that hex value to something different, he's got that design token or that friendly name available to him. And as he looks at this, he can come and inspect that. There's also the ability to grab the variables for the design, and those tokens, those friendly names, are included in the variable content as well. So if I come in, notice I have body text. That's one of the names I used. Another one, see as we look along, here's the H1 headline that's part of that CSS. So if you work in that environment, it gives you flexibility to change attributes, but keep those friendly names consistent. All right.
Hey, Dani, while you're there,
Sure
would
thing.
you mind? We had a question in the chat. Are full screen screenshots possible when I view the published link? I thought maybe you could show how you can go to full screen view while
Sure.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways you can work. That again, I just kind of went through them all when I was doing this essentials training this weekend. But the fact that you can save out as PDF, you can save out as a bitmap image, you can export the entire canvas, you can export specific artboards. It's amazing how many different ways you can grab the work you're doing. But as Tor's suggesting now, I have the ability when let's just see if I can get here. So I'm going to go back to the prototype view. Notice I have this little thing right here. I can come in and go full screen. And then I also can zoom now. So if I magnify this, for a time, we just basically showed it to you at actual size, because if your stakeholders wanting to judge the design, we wanted to make sure it was actual size and you could see that on the web. I now have the ability to come in and just zoom in on that as well. So depending on what you're doing as you're presenting, there's a lot of flexibility here. You can also just save out these artboards as an image file or a PDF that you can bring into Illustrator and actually iterate with the vector content and the image content when you work there. Sound good?
Okay, thank you. Yep, thank you.
All right. What's our time check? How much time do we have?
We are at 28 past the hour, so what we got? Stacks?
2 minutes? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, for stacks, I'll give you more time.
Oh, okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about stacks. So stacks are magic. And stacks start to work as a design system really well. So I'm torn because we don't have a huge amount of time. But there's a category in XD that's called content-aware layout as a broad topic. And the idea is that I can come into content that I have here. And the magic area, it really depends on where you're. Okay, one of the secrets behind XD is when you go to find something, if you can't find it, make sure you're in the right hierarchy in the layers panel, or be aware of a few things I'm going to show you right now, which is stacks and padding are designed to allow you to really treat your design objects as almost like Legos that you can move around and construct into larger systems. But stacks and padding rely on something being a group. So let me just try to build on this just for a little bit, and then I'll jump out and show you a finished version of it. But let's say I'm working here and I want to build out this calendar on the back end. And this is something that my team needs to use all the time. So when they're reflecting the calendar for the week, they want to be able to quickly come in, add and remove elements, juggle things around the way you would your real calendar from a design standpoint. So what I want to do is kind of build out this atomic hierarchical structure to my elements as I'm working. So one thing I did do, if I bring up the layers panel so we can keep an eye on it, is I have defined this as a component. And you can see the component there called bubble. And I duplicated it and put a second instance there. I also have a component that's here, and this has states applied to it. So they are, 3 different variances of this little label that I want to work with. Besides that, I've done really nothing else here. So as I build up this system, what I want to do is decide what I want to be part of a group. And when it comes to defining padding for a group of objects, XD is going to look to the backmost layer of that group and make that the background. So if this were actually, let's say all of these objects didn't have a background, I might draw a rectangle and make it transparent just to give this group of objects some bounds to it. I'm going to go ahead and select the content that I have here. And here in the properties inspector, I want to come in and group it, right? So let's just point out how I don't see the feature I want here, which always catches me for a second. I'll go ahead and group it. So I'll just right click and select group. When I do that, I suddenly see these layout options. Now, we've had responsive resize for some time. We continue, as I mentioned, to take new features and then rejigger other features so that they really work well together. Everything I'm going to show you, stacks and padding, works great with responsive resize. But now that I've defined it as a group, let me just show you how padding works. If I come on in and check that box, XD is going to analyze all of the content in this group that's sitting on top of this background image. And it's just going to measure the distance between each object and the edge. And by default, it's going to create padding values for that. So I've got that pad set. You can notice that it's 15 on one side, 17 on the other. I can always come here and say, you know what, let's make them the same on both sides. And as I do that, notice I get a highlight on the canvas indicating which of those pads I might be changing. I can come directly on the canvas and holding down the S key, just hover over any one of those and just visually make a change. I can always press and drag to change that out if I wanted to. So with that padding defined, I now just get some nice behavior. Let's say I'm designing a button and I want the top, bottom, left, and right of the button to always be the same, even as the side. This is actually a perfect example, right? So this has padding defined with it, and it's got that background that's been set, right? When I come in and change it to text that's smaller or larger, notice that that surround, like a button, it gets larger or smaller because it has padding that defines it. It's not going to overflow the bounds. So padding is one of the pieces. What I want to do is take this a level up now and define it as something known as a stack. So if I come in, XD is going to evaluate the content and decide if it seems like a horizontal or a vertical stack. When I check that box, it's going to make a guess, and it's done pretty well. This is a yes. I'm going to keep going. Now that I've defined that as a stack, what it allows me to do is look at the individual items inside of them, respect any padding I might have defined, and allow me to play around with it. So with this stack, I can come into some of my content and just press and drag. This is where it starts to behave a little bit like Legos. Now, I may or may not want to make that design change, but as we build, knowing that each group that I define has a set of padding and it has that intelligence starts to make things really kind of fun. So I'm going to combine things up a little bit here. I want to repeat this, and I'm going to be a little lazy. So I'll go ahead and use repeat grid. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to come into what I think is pretty terrific now, my padded little group of objects. And I'm going to make it a component. That gives me some flexibility as well. So I did that using keyboard shortcut. I see the visual indicator that this is now the main component. And when I come on in with repeat grid and drag out a few more, those are instances. So I could come back now to my design and say, wow, you know, I really did want this dumb thing to be up there on the top. And notice that it propagates to all of those instances. Everything works really well. I can continue to come in and vary things. So if I want to simulate the behavior of what we have here, I might say for this second object, if this is still a grid, it's behaving a little oddly because remember we put padding in there and it's adjusting that background bounds to the size that we just defined. I'm just going to guesstimate this for now. And I'll come on in and just set that. So even though I'm still in this repeat grid, I can come in and start to have my different layouts. I might come to some of them and have more information based on what I've got going on. So I can come in and do that. If I come to my actual content, probably. This is what becomes kind of funny is once you define padding, you need to remember that it's sort of relying on that padding. So if I do want to drag this guy down, I can do it manually here. and get my container to grow out a little bit. I might be breaking it here because that's how the demo gods are going to have me work. Once I get this set the way I want it to be, I can use that stacks feature with the parent or the group of individual objects that are within it. So let's say I think this is terrific. I'm going to select this whole set here. Let's go ahead and ungroup the grid. And I'm going to now take this selected set that all have individual padding defined to it. I'm going to group that together. And once again, I'll come into the stack area and I'll define it as another stack, right? Now I want to come on and start to just bring out my individual days. With that all set, you ready for the magic? I've got a group here. I've got nested inside of that, a group, and they all have intelligence about them. I'm going to come to all three of these now, and I'll go ahead and, what's the secret? Group them. Once I've grouped them, I'm going to stack them. Notice XD says, wow, I notice things are kind of going on the horizontal. I'm going to use the horizontal stack behavior. And I have this nice pecking order. So what I can do is come in and say, you know what, Monday, this one should be, they're all exactly the same. So you have to imagine with me, or just trust me for a moment as I come over in this direction. So with that same sort of mindset, I went in and built all of these guys out. I can now come in and say, let's swap these individual days out. Let's come on in and change the schedule out because it's using stacks to really separate these guys out. Let's come on into that individual component and change the label that's there. Notice it's really subtle and it's not a great design skill here, but notice when I jumped from a shorter label to a longer label, it's changing the overall container. So that padding behavior, looks like I need to get a little more padding on the right-hand side, but padding keeps an eye on the content and automatically moves things around and resizes them appropriately. So it's pretty amazingly magical. And everything that I'm showing you right now, the culmination of all that functionality is all available in XD as shipping features.
Thanks, Dani. Again, I love the stacks. It's just, I keep finding more and more, ways in which I can use it for things like tabs and button groups and all kinds of stuff, so I can easily swap things around and control the spacing. It's so fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions?
I don't think so. I think we're good. I think we're about at time, so let's start to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Dani.
Absolutely.
This has been great. Lots of great feedback in the chat.
Couple pointers if you want to see more of this. There are places to go to get more info. We always put together a blog post when we announce the new feature set, and that's where the videos that I create live. So the new feature videos live there. If you want older feature videos, my YouTube channel, if you search for Dani Beaumont on YouTube, I've got probably the last 3 years of new features are there, about 125 new feature videos there. And as I mentioned, for LinkedIn Learning, I've finished part 1 of the 2-part series with XD. As LinkedIn folks, you can go look at the design part of that. It includes all of the stacks and scroll groups that we just discussed. Just this weekend, I finished the second half. So it's going to take a couple weeks to come live, but part 2 will be there on LinkedIn Learning as well for much more of a deep dive around this capability.
Yeah, you just have a little bit of content that you've put together over the
just
years.
A little bit. XD makes it easy. There's always something to talk about.
And there's a whole YouTube video series on design systems too. There's just so much available content. So
yep.
Well, thank you so much again, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. We all hope you learned some new things that will help you with your design and your process. Our next session will be on September 10th, where we'll be joined by Justin Mitchell from So Friendly and Adobe's very own Mike Schwartz to discuss the XD plugins Draft XR and Yak, which I love saying. Plus, we'll provide tips for startups in today's market. So definitely not an event to be missed. And as a reminder, again, please fill out our survey. We really do appreciate your feedback, and you could win a year's worth of Creative Cloud. So
Looks like
you all.
there's actually just a quick ask in
Yeah,
the chat from Volley,
yeah.
wondering if he or she could watch this later. Looks like a bearded man, so I'm going to say he. We will have a link available. Do you know where folks can get that link?
Yeah, it should have been posted in the chat, but it should be on LinkedIn.
The recorded
Mm-hmm.
session?
All the recorded sessions are up on LinkedIn. Yep. Yep. So yeah, so please, you can go back and watch all the other videos that we put out this year. So lots of
Excellent.
great content. So thanks everyone, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.